Welcome to the Big Screen Symposium podcast. The Big Screen Symposium was held in Auckland at the Victory Events Centre on the 5th and 6th of April 2024. In this talk, Getting on the Same Page, writer and narrative designer Alexander Swords discusses the method he uses to get key creatives working together towards the same outcome. His one-page document is taken from a range of creative processes to act as a source of truth. It holds intention, facilitates clear communication, and helps teams hold themselves to account. During development, it can be used to provide prompts for all the important questions, and in production, it helps teams understand the relationship between the many elements that are coming together.
I am doing a talk on getting on the same page today, but I need to declare something you may not be aware of. I'm from games. I'm not from film and television. I have jumped the fence. I do believe, though, that we are basically all part of the screen industry, and there's a huge opportunity for us to not just share technology in the way that we make things, but also share... there's even more people coming in. To share craft, to share process. And that's kind of the stuff that I'll be going through today. I'm a writer, a narrative designer, and narrative director, and also a game runner. And so a lot of the problem that I face is actually just getting people on the same page to start off with, let alone trying to keep them on that same page 10 years. And, you know, as teams kind of expand. And usually what happens in games too is that I don't get brought in at the beginning. So some of the time, the first thing I need to do is actually find out what the hell we're working on. And a lot of the time, people haven't done the kind of process that we're going to be talking through today. So useful to get stuff out of your head and onto paper. First part of that being useful is actually clarifying your own ideas. It's something that goes on when, you know, you've got this beautiful vision in your brain, and then you need to actually think about how you're going to communicate that to other people. And then, of course, once it's on the page, hopefully you can see connections that you may not have otherwise seen before, other gaps that you might not see, or opportunities that might not otherwise have been present to you. And then, of course, you've got something that you can show other people, which is also really important. You can do that thing where someone excitedly comes into a room and goes, I have an idea. You can go, but does it fit on this? Is it relevant? No, great. We'll do that in the next project. And also keep yourself accountable, right? And in a good way. After 2 years, that really great idea that you had 2 years ago could just feel a bit boring. You need to be able to trust your previous self, that it has value. Which brings me to my last point. A lot of this stuff just surfaces the value of what you're trying to achieve. Super useful for first drafts, super useful when you're communicating to stakeholders, when you're onboarding team members, when you are trying to get re-enthusiastic about an idea, perhaps a decade after you've started it. So you can start anywhere on the sheet, but we'll start with the experience summary. It's just a very quick, very top-level breakdown, broken out into 5 elements. Who's your protagonist? What's your world and setting? Your medium and genre, your external hook, and your engagement hook. So protagonist, it's like what it says on the tin. Who is the person who's going to be moving the story forward? Very useful for your team, very useful for you know, the starting point of understanding your audience about how they might relate to this thing. We're going to be working with a bit of an example. It's on one side of the handout. So our protagonist is an older woman on a solo driving adventure. World and setting's really important. World could just mean, is it this universe, fantasy universe, science fiction universe? Setting obviously is really important on understanding scale. Important creatively, important for production. The experience we're creating today is in contemporary regional Australia. Medium and genre. This example basically is at a point where we don't know what this is, right? One of the biggest questions sometimes as storytellers is what the hell does this thing need to be to effectively tell story? So deciding what that medium is and that genre is really important. And the good thing about the example today, right, is like maybe we can go through all the way through this and then decide at the end, is this a game? Is it a film? Is it a short story? Is it whatever else we need? External hook is game language for what are external stakeholders going to talk about when they're talking about your project. The people who haven't actually engaged or been exposed to your content. There are even more people coming in. This is bonkers. And so it's what you feed to your marketing team, but it's also what you hope that, you know, the buzz that you'll create, people will actually talk about. It's very important for you to understand what that is, because obviously if someone says to you, what is this thing about? That's the thing you want to go to first, to let them know how they can talk externally about what's going on with your project. Engagement hook is also games language for what keeps them in the seat, whether it's a game or a film or whatever, what keeps them engaged, what is going to get them through, you know, either the hour-long show or the 7-hour-long limited series or a game that goes for 200 hours, right? That's the whole thing that kind of keeps them in the seat. Obviously important too when you're talking to, say, funders or marketing or anyone else who's going to be, it might be an intermediary between you and your audience as well. As assurance, that's the value, right? That's hopefully what they're actually going to get out of that experience.
Sorry, Alexander.
Yeah.
Would it look like at the highest level?
Yes.
Highest level.
At the highest level, I basically mean is like we're sacrificing nuance and detail for effective communication of what is the most important things with all of this kind of stuff, right? So if you had to explain to your mum what this is at the highest level, just to get her on board with the fact that you've chosen this life, even though she wanted you to be a doctor, that's the kind of level that we're working at. But very useful for onboarding, for funding agencies. People who work in funding agencies who may not have worked on projects before. It's no disrespect to them, but it's their gateway into buying in, being a champion for your project. Experience goals, this is what you want your audience to go through. And we've got some really nice prompts there, right? Hopefully we're making stuff where we want them to feel something. It can be as simple as we want them to feel sad, or it can be a bit more detailed and say we want them to feel hope about whatever it is that you might be putting in your content. Investigate, pretty self-explanatory. Exploring a theme, obviously we're all used to, hopefully, treating that with a lot of importance. Giving insight to, and what are they engaged by? So in games land, usually when we talk about engagement, how are they having fun in this kind of experience? But it's trying to make sure that you're actually thinking about it from their perspective and what you want to share with them through the experience that you're creating. So for examples for our long drive experience here, we want them to feel the excitement of experimenting with identity, feel the excitement of being reckless. We've got 2 feels there, perfectly fine. Use this how you need to for you, your project, and your team. And we want them to explore identity and defining meaning in life. So some pretty high-level themes that we're aiming for there. Narrative design pillars. So this is kind of gamey language, but I think it kind of applies. This is what you're doing with your story to deliver on that experience goals that we just had. So we've got things like story, obviously, whether it's going to be plot-driven, character-driven, whether it's going to be inspired by true life, all that kind of good stuff might be a pillar. Character, what actually, are they going to be deep characters, or is it going to be an ensemble set of more shallow characters? Art and music, production design, location, style, place and object, all of that kind of stuff can be narrative design pillars, right? It's early level, direction essentially for how you're going to turn this story into content that delivers on those experience goals that we were just talking about. So in this particular example, we have a deep, complex protagonist. So we're speaking to the character there. We're using the transcendental form, which is a type of narrative pattern that I'll be going through tomorrow if you're interested in that. And then mundane objects are given significance by experience. So if I was, say, being onboarded as a writer in this project, then I'm like, okay, cool. I don't quite understand necessarily what transcendental form means, but I know how to give significance to mundane objects, right? And so I know that on a regular basis through my script, there has to be some kind of connection between the significant event that the woman is going through and some kind of object that she might be taking away. And that's a whole thing of like, I took the bottle cap of the soft drink that I had because I had that really nice moment on the beach with so-and-so. Kind of stuff. Narrative design, high concept. This is how we break narrative down into its component elements, again, at a super high level. So we don't really have a synopsis in the same way that film and television would. It's easier for us to kind of break it down into a list of things that we might need to tell a story. The little bit of film consulting that I do, I now use this as a process of understanding what they're trying to achieve because it's a simpler way of looking at this stuff without having to go through the prose of a synopsis or treatment. So we break it down to character, who the hell the person is, what activities that character might be doing in this story, what resources they might be managing. I know that's a very gamey kind of term, resources, but essentially it's any variable that is managed either directly or indirectly by your character. The obstacles, anything that just prevents them from getting to their goals, and obviously what the hell their goal is. Those of you who are fans of, the dramatic question will know that it's, does the protagonist achieve the goal? That's only 2 elements. I find that that's just not enough, especially to understand a more complicated story. Hopefully you can already see here too that by putting it out this way, you can see the relationships between each of the different elements. And the different categories kind of point to the different functioning of what those elements do in the story. So in our example, we have a woman, she's curious, she's determined, she's a bit older. She's driving, she's adventuring, making friends, she's dating, she's having sex. She's managing time, either directly or indirectly perhaps, relationships, knowledge and place. She's trying to overcome ageism and distance to rediscover her love of adventure. Hopefully you can see that even in that very simple breakdown, there's a lot of potential for a really good story there yet. And we don't even know if it's a book or a film or a game yet. But as storytellers, we know there's potential there. Audience is obviously very important. It was funny when I came through film school, they kept saying, you need to write to your audience. And no one actually taught me how to think about audience. So this stuff actually kind of comes from the arts management stuff that I did when I bounced out of the industry for a while. And we use a term called psychographics rather than demographics. Doesn't mean that demographics can't be mentioned. It just means that psychographics, so the behavior of your audience, gives context to the kind of people that you're trying to target. And so this might be cultural consumption, lifestyle, other hobbies that they have, experiences that they're seeking, and also just how they have fun, how they actually go about being engaged themselves. For this example, we have grey nomads. Does everyone know what grey nomad is? I don't know if does it happen over in New Zealand? It's a bunch of old white people having a midlife crisis going, oh my God, I need to discover myself out in the world. It's actually really good. It's just a shame they didn't do it earlier in their life. I hold back. I'm very reserved in my opinions. You'll learn that. Fans of drama, good stuff. Anyone who's questioned the meaning of their own life, which I find a really interesting kind of prompt because there are some people who are like, I don't think I've ever actually sat down and thought about the meaning of my own life. And we'll get into why that's important in a hot second. And audience motivations. This is very game design-y type stuff. So you can't learn basically game development without understanding what we call player motivation usually, but it actually crosses over into audience motivation because while in games, perhaps the player is actually doing the thing, the great thing about motivations is they're actually activated by watching, by seeing, by people modeling that kind of behavior. So it may not be as strong a feeling necessarily if they're not actually in the seat themselves, but they still respond. And that's that whole thing of like when you're watching a horror film, you're like, don't go up the stairs, right? That's your motivations being activated by what you're seeing and the person in front of you. It's probably a little bit hard to see. There's a bunch of them there, but the categories are essentially, we have action, which is destruction. That's not going to help. Action, which is destruction and excitement. Social, which is competition and community. Mystery, which is challenge and strategy. Achievement, which is completion and power. Immersion, which is fantasy and story. Creativity, which is design and discovery. They're in the blue category because they're not all strictly from this research, but generally speaking, in game design land, all of that is built on the psychology that came out of motivational research from the 1970s with white American college students. And so what that led to was this really terrible understanding of human nature purely through flight or fight as a motivation. If stress happens, they're the only two responses that were allowed to happen, apparently. The red ones there, you'll see are a little bit more soft and squishy. We have care, which is tend and befriend, and we have curiosity, which is journey and wisdom. So what came about was some motivational scientists grabbed some human neuroscientists and went, look what happens when we electrocute rats. And all the rats fought each other. And the human neuroscientists went, humans don't do that. Maybe there's something else that we should look here. And so they did this research about tend and befriend, where in a stressful situation, people will care. People will automatically go to compassion. And so that's that situation where if someone comes at you and they're angry and they want to punch you in the head, you actually stop and go, are you okay? You know, it's not a fight, it's not a flight response, it's a care response. You know, you want to tend. There's a perception of this person is angry and upset because they're vulnerable somehow. And we need to obviously be aware of that because it's also super, super powerful. All the blue stuff is essentially adrenal driven, right? It's momentary. You have that moment of excitement either by the challenge or by the achievement, and then it's gone. The tend and befriend stuff is the warm and fuzzy stuff. I believe it's the oxytocin, and it's long-term, right? You can see this stuff and it will still be with you potentially hours later. That's the kind of process where we actually build memories. And so always reaching for the excitement is actually a really good way of actually stopping your audience from thinking and feeling empathy. The best way to do it is actually for them to see care, for them to see someone in the pursuit of wisdom that is of benefit to their community. Cool. So that's it. They're the 6 different instruments that we use. We've gone through them individually. Hopefully you understand how all of those just act as questions, right? Just questions that you should be asking yourself, and not necessarily just at the beginning of the project, but you should keep kind of coming back to on a regular basis. Also, hopefully you can see too, is you don't need to complete it necessarily. This is a developmental kind of process. You can leave some blanks. This should change over time. What's important though is you understand that if you do change one thing, you are going to be impacting, the other things that you're considering in that kind of instrument. Wow, I'm barreling through this. This is great. I want to make sure that there's questions at the end because contextualizing this is super important. Cool. So this is the advantage of having it all on the same page. I can't do all of this as one big page because the screens are a little bit too small. So I'm breaking this down. But essentially what we can now do is use each of those instruments to validate each other, to know that we've set a course and at least we can identify perhaps the holes that we have. So working with the example that we've got of the long drive, we have our experience goals, and we're comparing them to the narrative design pillars. The purpose of doing that, obviously the experience goals is what we're aiming for. The way of delivering that is through the narrative design pillars. So we need to make sure that those pillars actually will deliver that experience. So in this case, one of our design pillars is deep, complex protagonist. Great, that will probably deliver feeling the excitement of experimenting with identity, because hopefully a deep, complex protagonist has enough there that that experimentation can take place in an exciting context. And then also it delivers on exploring identity and defining meaning of life, because hopefully if you've got a deep protagonist, they are the kind of person perhaps who will take that question seriously. And so we'll deliver that experience goal because your audience will be able to observe them. So then we have the transcendental form. This kind of structure is just very good at establishing meaning of life or the changing of meaning of life. If you want to know more about that, I'll be going into it tomorrow. The quick version of that, I guess, is if you want the film kind of quick version, there's a book called The Transcendental Style in Film. I can't remember the author's name, but he basically breaks how this form is used through film across 3 different cultures, if you're interested. But the point is, it's slow. So if you've heard of slow cinema before, a lot of that transcendental style kind of comes from that idea of slow cinema. And then we've got mundane objects are given significance by experience. That should deliver nicely this sense that this person is exploring, identity and the definition of their lives. Hopefully you can see already, if the goal is to get them to feel like there is that sense of exploration, having a set of objects at the end of your narrative experience where the audience knows what the significance of basically is useful as mapping out that kind of experience, as an example. So what we have identified, though, is at the moment, none of our narrative design pillars will deliver on our experience goal of feeling the excitement of being reckless. So that's a question that we need to answer, and we probably need to answer it sooner rather than later, because experience goal can sit at the top, right? It's the ultimate, what we're kind of aiming for in this. So it's called the long drive. She's going to be driving. We could just get her a sports car. The sports car itself wouldn't necessarily, aside from being horribly tropey, wouldn't necessarily deliver on that goal, right? Partly also because there's not really much of an emotional aspect there, but there's a whole lot of societal baggage that kind of comes with it. So what we might want to do then is actually maybe talk to our production designer. How do we give this character, this car, some character? How do we make it another character in this kind of story? And we make that a narrative design pillar. Your production designer, this is you. This is your main goal during production, is to turn this sports car with all this tropey nonsense attached to it into something meaningful, into something new that the story can have dialogue with. So we've validated mostly our experience goals and our narrative design pillars. We know that our narrative design pillars will at least deliver most of the experience goals that we've got. But does our story have enough for our design pillars to sit on to actually achieve that? Is something else that we need to validate. So our narrative design pillar is a deep, complex protagonist. Great. We have someone who happens to be curious, determined, and older. That feels like there's enough potential in that character description to be able to sit that design pillar on. Transcendental form, being slow and reflective. That's great. In our activities there, we've got driving, lots of opportunity there for those kind of reflection moments. And we know that in this story, we're managing time and knowledge, which is part of that reflective kind of process. And the rediscovering her love of adventure is right up the alley of what the transcendental form is good at. Mundane objects are given significance by experience. Great. So we're looking for opportunities where objects may appear and be given that significance. Making friends, dating, and sex may or may not be an object involved with sex, but we're looking for the symbolism that might come out of those moments for whatever reason. And place too. Place and object usually have a strong association, right? If a place means something, it's not uncommon for people then to take an object because that place is significant. Okay, so we've done the narrative side. We've basically validated, at least at this early stage, the different kind of elements that we've got that might all work together. So there's at least enough to know that on the narrative side, this thing is probably going to function in the way that we would hope that it would do. Obviously, what we need to do now is make sure that it actually connects with the audience. So we're starting again with experience goals, but we're testing it against our understanding of the audience, our audience psychographics, which is good because our experience goals feel the excitement of experimenting with identity. So let's look at our audience, grey nomads. Do they feel the excitement of experimenting with identity? And would they feel that by seeing this? Probably. They're looking for excitement. They're usually at that point of, of age where they're trying to think about their legacy or the meaning of their life. So there's a good chance that grey nomads are probably going to relate to the content that we're putting in this thing. Fans of drama, we're experimenting with identity, right? That's always a good thing for drama to kind of get stuck into. And anyone who's questioned the meaning of their life, obviously we're doing identity and meaning. So we're good to go. Our audience is going to be totally on board for that experience goal. Feel the excitement of being reckless. Grey nomads, not all of them are reckless, but there is an element of recklessness to it still. It's still seen as a bit of a punk act. And certainly there are some that I've met. I recently took the train through Central Australia with my mum, where we got to Kings Canyon, I think it was. And it was, do you know you can spend $200,000 on a caravan? I didn't. I was blown away. Anyway, and so I met this guy and he'd basically just sold his house so they could buy a caravan for $200,000. I would call that reckless, but you live your best life. Anyway, so would he relate to this? Hells yes. Absolutely, right? If he is like a good representative psychographic, of our audience, then definitely would understand this stuff. And anyone who's questioned the meaning of their own life is probably going to relate to that as well, because there is an element of recklessness that helps with that experimentation with redefining what the meaning of your life might be. Exploring identity and defining meaning of life. Yeah, cool. Fans of drama are on board. We don't need to worry about that too much. And anyone who's had an existential crisis about the meaning of their life is obviously on board with this. But that's the narrative design pillars. That's how we're going to deliver it. Is there story content that's going to be relatable to this audience? Strangely enough, yes, because I created this myself. Grey nomads, they're curious. We've got all the activities that grey nomads are used to doing, right? They're driving, they're adventuring, they're making friends, and they're having sex. I will explain, I guess, why this is the example. It's inspired by a story in The Guardian about the fact that doctors in regional towns in Australia who've not even had to think about sexually transmitted diseases for decades are now suddenly having to do sexual education for their older population because grey nomads are running around the country fucking everyone. And I think that's fascinating and interesting and something that we just don't talk about. Old people do have sex. Don't be fooled. Anyway, so they're doing that. And then while they're doing that, they're managing relationships and, they're literally managing place. Like in their day-to-day life, they've got that agency to choose where they want to be. And they face ageism, absolutely. Distance is always a bit of an issue that they have to manage as an obstacle. And a lot of them are rediscovering their love of adventure, right? So good, we've got all that story content. It's definitely going to work with grey nomads. Fans of drama, yeah, that's cool. All those activities lead to all the good stuff that we can do for fans of drama. And anyone who's questioned the meaning of their own life, ageism is going to work really well in terms of story content because I find a lot of people have been othered by prejudice have then asked themselves, why are they here on some kind of level, or what is their place in society? So anyone who's gone down that road with reflection and hopefully come out the other side intact is possibly going to be interested in that kind of content and rediscover her love of adventure. Yeah, a lot of the time when people are trying to work out meaning in their life, they usually come back to earlier times where they felt free, where they felt like they had agency to adventure in some kind of way. And obviously what we're talking about here when we say rediscover her love of adventure, we're not just talking about the fact that she's driving around in a car, right? It's the adventure of meeting new people and dating people and having sex and learning about yourself, all that good adventure stuff. Audience motivations, I think this is the last one. I mean, you can chop and change these as you kind of need, but I just want to impress upon you how these and why you would want to have these kind of conversations. Again, this is just making sure that, so we know that in terms of their audience behavior, the story content is there. They've got something to relate to. Is there enough in there though for them to feel something, based on what motivations they have, is what we also need to look at. So befriending by making friends in the short term, great. Your audience will see this woman making friends, relating about things that perhaps they haven't related to someone in such a long time. Hopefully they'll get the warm and fuzzies, right? This is a nice moment and we want to see that kind of connection. We respond to that. Same with rediscovering her love of adventure, a little bit like what I was talking about. That befriending process is a part of that adventure, making new friends that you haven't met before. Will they see fantasy of a carefree existence? Yeah, great. We've got a really good example of a carefree existence there. We've got it on two levels. Again, we've got her driving around the country, but also living in a much more carefree way in terms of who she might be dating, how she might be dating those people. And that, again, that carefree existence that can be involved with the experimentation of rediscovering a love of adventure and going on that journey. Hopefully, you want your audience to know what's happening next. That's what's going to keep them in the chair. But again, we've got a lot of very specific story content there that will actually help with that kind of activation. So the good thing about the journey stuff in particular is you don't need to work very hard to actually trigger that motivation in people. You just need to have a likable, interesting, relatable character. And usually that's enough. And it kind of really doesn't matter in what kind of setting you put them or story you put them through. If you've hooked them, with that kind of relationship with that character, that journey motivation will actually keep them through even some of the mistakes that you might make as a storyteller, right? That's part of that reason why people will sit through, that terrible one season of that show that they love is usually just because they've got that one character that they adore and they want to see how it ends, even after you've made that horrible mistake of season 3, because Netflix gave you an algorithm to abide by. Did I say that out loud? Sorry. Getting it literally all on the same page is really useful because it's visual. You can talk about it. That process of doing, not just getting it on the same page, but doing those exercises that we just went through in terms of how these different instruments validate each other is obviously really valid. What I would say, though, is don't do them by yourself, right? They are supposed to be team exercises. And that's where you're going to get some really interesting things come out of it, because I'm sure some of you are sitting there going, does this guy even know an older woman? Has he even spoken to one recently? Because I am making assumptions. Or if you're thinking that, then you're criticizing my mum because I spoke to her about this example. But it's valid, right? That's how we do the checks and balances and stuff. And like I will say to you, if you do your audience psychographics and then you look around the room and none of the people in the room share that, that behavior, especially cultural background, then you've got a bit of an issue. Are you even capable of actually telling an authentic story in this case? And then, of course, you've got two choices. You either change the project to suit the people you're working with, or you need to think about changing your team. Because all of this is supposed to not just look like a sexy diagram. It's supposed to be a series of questions, right? Individual questions about their particular kind of elements that make these stories, make these experiences work. And then within those, questions of each other, right? Every answer that you provide is a new question to everything else that's within that instrument. And then, of course, every answer in that instrument is then a question. That needs to be not necessarily consistent, right? It doesn't need to all 100% match. And I would say that there's probably a bit of groupthink if you've got this entire thing just kind of making way, way, way too much sense. But it does mean that if you do want to change something, you can see the implications, right? You can decide what is the problem. Do we really know our audience? Great, let's spend some time with the audience instrument. Do 3, 5, 10 versions of what your audience psychographics might look like, and then cross-compare with the other instruments that are on the page. So just in a practical sense, usually what happens with my projects is we print this out in an A2, we laminate it, we get out some whiteboard markers, and then we start drawing lines across to make sure that we're asking ourselves the right questions. And obviously we get it out on a regular basis too. It just becomes part of the process to check. The useful thing for me in particular is a lot of the time I work remotely. And so a lot of this is also just about making sure that this kind of information is accessible. In games, we have an idea of a game Bible, and I hate them because they're just huge blocks of text. And a lot of them are just kind of stream of consciousness kind of stuff. And so it's very difficult to then pull out some of this, or even for me to look at that and go, what is the value here? Not even necessarily like what is the value of the project, but what's the value of the idea here? Because that way of presenting information can be actually some of the worst ways of doing it. The other good thing about this too is it seems to, at least in my experience, take away a lot of the conflict, because ambiguity is a lot of the issue when it comes to conflict. Ambiguity about who owns what, and then ambiguity about what the hell it is that you're actually trying to achieve. This won't necessarily cure it, but it definitely seems to do quite well at facilitating really good discussion about it, right? At the very least, you can all point to this and go, a year ago, we had some good ideas. Maybe we should just trust ourselves from a year ago. I had a really interesting experience, though. I'm working on a game called Totem Teller, and I don't have favorite clients, but it's my favorite. And the art that I've got behind is actually from that game. And I started working on it in the beginning of 2019, and then obviously COVID happened. We were in lockdown in Melbourne for God knows how long. I changed as a person. The developer I worked with changed as a person. And so getting a little bit emotional, one of the moments of reconnection for us was actually to bring this up and go, are we the people to make this game that we'd decided before? And so we had a really nice moment of going, okay, there was some closure there for us in a situation where there just really wasn't any closure. It was, they were like, you're allowed out of your apartments now. Woot. But for us as creatives, it was a nice bit of closure of like, this is not us and this is not the project anymore. Let's refresh and start again. Any questions?
Yeah, I'm really curious how and why you settled on these 6 pillars as the best way to do this.
As in why the page looks the way that it is?
As in like why the page is the way that
It's got the stuff that it's got on it.
Specifically each,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it's about understanding that, I might have a vision, but it needs to actually kind of land in someone and kind of mean something for them when they go through that experience. And so a lot of this stuff is either begged, borrowed, or stolen from a whole bunch of different arts practice. So for myself, trained in film and television, went off into experimental art and video, which went into like interactive installation, and then now into video games and so on and so forth. So experience goals in particular is it's come from software development, like what are we actually trying to achieve? And it's based on lean methodology. You just make what you know to answer the question or to, give the user, the experience that you're intending for them or what they want. And so experience goals actually facilitate that really well because you can literally ask the person, did you feel this? Yes or no? No? Crap. We have to do it again. And so design pillars then is about how to deliver it. The narrative high concept is the content itself. And then there's the 2 bits of audience breakdown. Who are they and what are they motivated by? And it's like I said, the motivation stuff is really useful for me because I realized that was a bit of a revelation for me because I realized, we talk a lot about empathy for characters when audiences are watching, but how does empathy work? How does that connection actually work? There's a good academic psychological underpinning for how this stuff kind of functions. So if you're curious about any of these, go to Google Scholar and just start Googling this kind of stuff because almost all of it has some kind of psychological underpinning to it. This is maybe the difference between writing and narrative design, right? Design, you're understanding the function to deliver some kind of meaningful experience to a user. And so this is very design thinking. What how do we break down an entire experience? What are the component parts? How do they function? And then what's important for each of those different contexts? What I will say too, though, is like being so high level, use it how you need to, get your own understanding of how to use it, contextualize it for yourself, right? There's no real one right way of doing this. The main goal of this is, again, is like making sure you're asking yourself the right questions and then actually having conversations about those answers.
I just had a question around when you've used this on a project and then seen it to completion. Has anything surprised you about like audience response or things you thought would work as per your, like just...
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, so this is where I guess games and film and television differ quite a lot because we test a lot more often, right? When we are making something, we're usually just making the absolute smallest version of it to answer a question. And that question might be something uncertain that we've seen here. So in terms of Totem Teller, like one of the questions that we've always had is like, it's very ornamental. In most games, they just reuse assets. That's part of the efficiency of game making. But this is all line drawn and very deliberate and very bespoke. We need to know if that's actually valuable or not. So very early on, we just did like a very short playthrough of 30 seconds. And then we started talking to our audience. The important thing, though, is like instead of saying to them, do you find the ornamentation valuable? We went back to our experience goals and went, how do you feel about this? And then they would talk about their feelings. And if the feelings matched what our experience goals were, then good. We know because that was an art test, essentially, that is feeding into the feelings that we're doing. Are there surprises? Almost always. The useful thing about this, too, is after you've launched, then having what we call a retrospective and sitting down with this and going, how close did we get to this? And what I find too is like, it's really quite liberating because especially when you're working with something like experience goals, there's so many different ways of achieving most of those things. And so as long as you're able to step back from your vision a little bit and go, wait, the most important thing here is that we need them to say, feel comfort in a process of grieving. There's lots of different ways to do that. It's not necessarily, we'll have a funeral scene where this kind of stuff happens. Maybe that actually needs to happen outside with this character on their own. And it just frees up that kind of creative process, which is also where some of those surprises do kind of come from. Because we're like, especially because like Totem Teller now is old enough that there's just some things that we just can't go back on. And so there is a little bit of like, okay, hopefully we'll get there. And also too, just that delightful thing where like different audiences will interpret things in different ways. And this is really useful then because then we can compare what they're saying with what we've done and gone, it's very rarely negative. It's just they've, been inspired in a different kind of way.
This is so fantastic. I love it. I love that it pulls from design and tech and film and everything. In terms of making a feature film and the length of time between developing an intention-setting piece of work like this and getting that payoff with the audience is a long time. I'm aware that Danny Philippou is in another room talking about all the work that they've done on YouTube to know, what it is they do and what it is they make. And the question really is, in the world that sits between guys like that who create every day and people who, might work on one film for 10 years, any advice? And how to use this for testing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first of all, if you're not aware, there's a book called The Art of Lean Filmmaking. And so it takes a lot of the design philosophy that I've been kind of touching on, the iterative approach, and applies it to feature film. It's got a really good case study in it where a group of people came together wanting to make their first feature film. So the goal was actually just to make a feature film and takes you through that process. It flattens the power structure. There's just constant testing. Right? So they establish things like this, and then they're even at the very early stages, they'll take something like this and have conversations with their audiences. So from memory, their case study was about women backpackers traveling alone. So they were like, they just went to women backpackers and went, what would you want to see in a movie? We're inspired. And like the good thing too is things like, they just make the smallest part that they need to answer the question. So it might even be, well, we've got this design pillar, perhaps we have a strong, bulletproof female protagonist. Does that achieve, this particular experience goal? And so they would just get a mobile phone and one of the actors and, basically just do a short kind of 30 or 40 second whatever on the phone, and then go back to the backpackers. What do you think about this character? How does she make you feel? What would you want from this character? That kind of stuff. And it's just this cycle that happens really, really fast. And it's always audience informed. Not the most amazing thing. One of the really cool things about it was their screenings they ended up getting paid to screen their film in backpacker hostels in Melbourne. Like, it was a direct connection with their audience that way. And so this facilitates that kind of process because, again, each of these are questions. And so you can essentially, on those longer projects, make something a lot smaller, perhaps just to answer those particular questions. And trust yourself from 18 months ago when you did this process and was excited about it. That can be the hard part. I think we had one at the back in the middle.
It's obviously an overarching document for the whole project, and you've got the main character you're focusing on here. Do you break out elements of this for the other characters as well and have a...
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. So the high concept formula doesn't just have to be for your protagonist. It can be for any character that you find important. It breaks down any kind of story that you need it to. And so what we might do, especially if it's a bit more of an ensemble piece, is have a whole bunch of high concept formulas for each of the different characters. So then we can essentially do what we've done here. We have them all on the one page, and then we see what's common and not between them. We have words for that. It's like, what elements of different characters are sitting in opposition or in synergy, or what's happening in one character that's actually describing an absence of something in another character, which is really, really difficult to do on screen sometimes. So there's that. And also too, you can essentially assign different characters to achieve different parts of this, right? So we've got an experience goal about feeling the risk of exploring. It doesn't necessarily have to be attached to the protagonist. It's possibly, she might actually mean someone else who's going on a slightly similar journey, but doing the exciting kind of risky side of it as well. So you can essentially just, use this however you need to. If you wanted to go actually bonkers crazy, you could do a version of this for every single character. But for a feature film, I think that's way, way over-engineering. I'm crying inside because I'm working on a role-playing game with 26 characters. And I'm kind of come to the realization that I almost need to do one of these for every single character in that game because games be crazy.
In that situation, would the various audience-focused questions be about how the audience experiences that character?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, what audiences am I specifically targeting with that kind of character is super, super important. It's definitely because we do, with 26 characters, obviously, there's a lot of diversity in there as well. And I don't want to assume that I'm speaking to the right people through that character. And so I get people who look like the character that I'm trying to create, talk to them about, their behaviors and what they would want to see in that kind of character, and just do that check and balance. So at the very least, I'm starting from a good place, but it's, a constant process of checking.
Thanks. Alexander, I'm just wondering, in terms of the audience motivations, have you found that there's, in terms of the number of audience motivations that a thing can contain, is there sort of a sweet spot? Like, do they all start to water each other down, or do they sort of work synergistically? Is having just one make something really impactful? Can you talk about that?
You can kind of have as many as you like. So humans are delightfully complex. And so there just ends up being a bit of a difference between what they are aware of consciously and then what's kind of working subconsciously as well. So, if you start talking to people about how they were motivated and what was triggered, inevitably they'll pick the one that comes to mind and they'll talk about that. And then if you ask them further, then you're able to kind of break things down. So if it's one of those things where if it's some kind of action scenario, destruction is fun. We like breaking things. But if you talk to someone a little bit further about, well, why is that fun? Then they might they'll start talking about the reason for why that thing's being destroyed. And then you're talking about whatever motivations are attached to that. So, if you need to break a big gate to free a whole bunch of people, great. The breaking stuff is exciting, and they're probably going to talk about that kind of motivation first, that excitement of like, yeah, I wanted to be the thing that broke the gate, blah. But what they'll end up talking about, and usually this is part of the reason why I make sure that I talk about it, is underneath that is actually a bit of a tending process, because the reason for breaking that gate is actually to tend to some vulnerable people who were stuck behind that gate. Trust your audience. Trust that they're emotionally intelligent enough to be triggered by the stuff that they're seeing to activate these motivations in ways. You'll tie yourself in knots, though, if you're trying to get them all to compete. If you want them to feel too many things at once, then that's a bit of an issue. The benefit you have, though, is all of the ones in blue are momentary. They're the quick ones. You probably need to keep showing them content that will trigger those motivations anywhere between every 30 seconds and 2 minutes to 5 minutes, which is why action films kind of have that rhythm of and this new thing and this new thing and the raising of the stakes. The warm and fuzzy stuff, the tend and befriend, that's long-term. So that's fine, right? So, and we already see that in Western conventions where there'll be a whole bunch of action and there'll be that nice quiet moment where two people are bonding together. And that's generally, how those films are successful, even though the story might actually be really woeful. It's because we just can't help it. Most of us will respond in a positive way to seeing people respond to each other in a positive way. The good thing is for filmmakers, especially action folks, is cool, you've ticked the box of the warm and fuzzies. That stuff will last you half an hour, maybe an hour, and that's also why it can be really useful in streaming to end on the warm and fuzzies rather than the action cliffhanger, because you want the warm and fuzzies to last I'm going to stop and make myself a cup of tea and whatever. Action cliffhangers don't work as well in that kind of context because the motivation fades. And if you've got them too excited, they'll do that thing where they're I literally need a break. I'm overstimulated and you're a bit too much. So a balanced diet of motivations is what I recommend.
I was just having a look. You worked on a game, Totem Teller?
I am still working on that game, yes.
Cool. Are you able to talk about how you interacted with that company in terms of a real world example of this being used?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of those situations. So almost every game that I work on is a third of the way into development. No one really knows what that means, but I'm definitely I'm not brought in at the beginning often. And so I basically I developed this process as it is essentially to solve that problem, because I have to sit down with them and go, what game are you making? And, inevitably, there's two things that happen. There's a whole bunch of stuff they just haven't thought of, because a lot of game designers just aren't even taught how to think about these sorts of stuff. A lot of game designers aren't even taught to think about their audience. It was interesting with Ben, who's the creative director on Totem Teller, though, because he very much understood what he wanted to bring from the art and design side of it. And so it had kind of left a bit of a good hole there for where narrative could kind of deliver it. And so the rest of it was quite simple. We just needed to talk about our experience goals. What are we trying to achieve in this kind of scenario? And then how narrative can do it. So what that basically meant was, in terms of audience, he was pretty confident of that. Audience psychographics, audience motivations, good to go. We just had some questions of what is he trying to achieve? And he's a bit of a hippie. So he was I just want people to kind of reflect on life and feel good. I'm not useful, Ben. In this kind of context, let's give it a little bit more specific about it. And so we did. And it's funny because we actually bonded over things the game, it's about the nature of inspiration, but we do that against the background of folktales and storybook, stories and that kind of stuff. And so one of the experience goals that came out of it was actually draw people's attention to the fact that, Hansel and Gretel is a horrendous story. And we just give it to kids and we don't talk to them about abandonment or the fact that not all stepmothers are evil or, all that kind of stuff. Let alone the fact that it touches on feminism and different types of feminism and, the fact that the brother's innocence is held up as more important than the trauma of the sister having to kill another woman. Cool, we'll just give that to kids. Anyway, so we bonded over that kind of conversation. And so that's become one of our experience goals, is to draw attention to, the actual nature of these stories, because they're taken for granted. And we wanted people to not take those stories for granted anymore, which then led to the narrative design pillar of our presentation of Hansel and Gretel in particular cannot just be a one-for-one reproduction, right? We knew that at some point we were going to subvert the hell out of Hansel and Gretel to really twist it. So a little bit of spoilers. We're giving the Hansel and Gretel doesn't really have a third act. It just kind of goes from second act, sister's trauma. Yay, Dad, we're back. And so we're actually giving the sister character an ending to that story as a way of subverting everything that kind of comes before that. But almost without fail, every single project. Cool. What are your experience goals? You've got no idea. Great. Let's have a conversation about it. And making sure too that there is time to have those conversations. So a lot of what I find here is like we'll start with, say, design pillars and we'll end up talking about memories, right? What our own kind of motivations are in different situations. And especially on Totem Teller, why did you pick that building, Ben? Oh, because I had a dream that time and then I had a conversation with my son and now he wants to go there because he found a picture of one that's like that in Barcelona, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now in Totem Teller, there is an element of the architecture of Barcelona based on this memory that he has talking to his son about the dream that he had. So, which is great. So sometimes when he comes up with this kind of stuff, I do kind of have to just tap this and go, Ben, is that in here somewhere? And it's good. We're in this nice flow where he's like, that's really cool, but it's got nothing to do with that. So we'll just safely put that down the front. You're not allowed to speak without the microphone.
Can I speak now?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. One for a better word. If we were to draw another line and call it the execution of the design, how do you transfer what you've got there into what it should be, i.e. a book, a game, all of the above?
Yeah, well, hopefully that's where some of this stuff will actually then, directly connect with whatever the kind of production process is, right? So if this was going to be a feature film, then I would sit down with the production designer and first of all go, does this make sense to you? And have that kind of conversation. And then also, is there enough space for you to do your process, to do your work? And what I found too is like, even though this has kind of become a bit standardized, to me, it can, because it's so high level, it's quite flexible at interfacing with everything else. And I don't know what film is like these days, but every game project I work on is so different that there is almost no point in me standardizing my process past this point. And part of that is actually just the people. And so in asking them, does this make sense to you? What I'm actually asking them is, how do you like to communicate? What is your process? And that's also, unfortunately, one of the roadblocks that I kind of come up against is that people don't understand their own process enough to even answer the question that you're asking in terms of where we go from that. The idea also too, obviously, is just things like if we are in film and television land and you want to do a first draft of your synopsis, I would go to the high concept formula. Write it out as a sentence. This is a film about a woman who's curious and determined, who drives, adventures, makes friends, dates, and possibly has sex while she's aware of time passing, forging new relationships and learning things while trying to overcome ageism, looking to fall in love with adventuring again. It's a clunky as hell sentence. But at least once you've got that clunky sentence, you've hit every single important element. And because you've validated that against everything else on the page, then you can go with at least a bit of confidence that there's enough in that synopsis that the person you're talking to is going to ask questions. And hopefully the other stuff on the page is then going to provide some of the answers. So why would you make it this character? Oh, well, the experience that we're trying to create is X, Y, Z, because we're looking at this experience going in front of a certain type of audience that's motivated by tend and befriend and that kind of scenario. I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer for you. I'm sorry. But it's also really important, I think, for people to actually find their own ways in their own contexts for their own process as well. So there has to be a little bit of, let's call it translation, between where I'm coming out with this and what you need. I'm not even advocating that you keep this as it is. Take what you need or not, as the case may be. Change it or not, as the case may be. I highly recommend that you do a bit of research, at least some basic Googling on some of this kind of stuff, so you understand the philosophy underneath it. And talk to your teams about it as well. Okay. That was the question that I was scared of when I came here. I'm like, it's been so long since I've been in film and television land. Am I going to be able to make that kind of connection? Yeah. Do we have a little bit more time? One more. Who wants the pressure of up the back there? Absolutely. This is the one where you need to ask me a question that rounds everything up together and gives me a nice, no, it doesn't. No pressure, no pressure.
Kia ora. Ko Janie Tuhura Tuka Wingoe. Is it important to define each and every character in your story as a writer?
Is it important to define each individual character? I don't. So I guess the answer is no. But I mean, there's different ways of writing, right? And this has been the interesting thing coming at it from originally film and television and going into games is you can, work from big picture down into detail, or you can start with detail and work your way out. My practice has landed on the second option. I work in detail and then write as much story that I need to kind of facilitate the story that I'm telling. And so I've gotten out of the habit essentially of going, well, I need this kind of character. I'll do a full character sheet and I'll do full research and so on and so forth. Partly because if I want to make a change later down the track, then it's really hard. I basically need to re-research. I might as well do, an entire new character. And so I've found ways of doing shortcuts to work out exactly just what I need for that character to kind of function. And some of that is a little bit like what we were talking about before in terms of like, I'll do a high concept formula, partly because it gives me some really good knowledge of what that character might be. Who are they and what is their goal? It's usually the two things that we need. The rest of the stuff may not actually be useful. So at the very least, I'll do a high concept formula for them. And if that serves the function, then great. And what I'm looking for there is just potential. It's possible that I could bring in more detail then about what kind of character they are and what actually motivates them and how all that stuff kind of links together. But if I don't need to make that decision at that point, then I'm, especially in games, because things change all the time, I'm just better off not. And it's funny because I felt really guilty and a bit lazy about that for such a long time. And then I read an essay by Ursula K. Le Guin. And she was like, I think literally said, fuck that shit. These characters just come to me and they fulfill a role. And so why would I spend all that time, on characters that don't necessarily mean as much to me? And they are there for a purpose. And if they're not there for a purpose, or I'm not clear why they're there, then maybe I shouldn't have them at all.
So it's still a good idea to allow the audience to come to their own characterization of the definition of that character?
So this is the other side of that coin. The good thing when you do that is you effectively make a space for your audience's imagination. And this is where some of the game theory actually works really well with film and television, because you create an absence there that then, the audience can actually inhabit. This is part of the reason why audiences, turn off if you show the monster in a horror film, because you fill that hole for them. There's no mystery there. There's nothing for them to engage with anymore. So you're very welcome.
Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, everyone, for being so generous to be honest here. I appreciate it. Thank you.
The Big Screen Symposium 2024 was presented by Script to Screen. We gratefully thank our event partners, the New Zealand Film Commission, Images and Sound, New Zealand On Air, and Te Mangai Paho. Voiceover is by Jamie Irvine and the music is by Poddington Bear. You can read more about these speakers at our website, www.bigscreensymposium.com. This podcast is brought to you thanks to generous support from Images and Sound.